He turned burglary into high art.
Probably one of the most brilliant thieves that I've ever come across in my career.
It was his job, his hobby, his amusement.
I think he thought that it was an easier way to make money than being some schlub who went to work 9 to 5 every day.
He got his kicks and lined his pockets with millions.
Made enough money doing what he did to purchase a helicopter, at least one boat.
For decades, there was nothing cops could do to catch the Caped Cat burglar known as Superthief. In 1979, the wealthy residents of Fort Lauderdale were living it up under the Florida sun. Beautiful houses, lavish jewels, stacks of cash, all protected by bolted doors and burglar alarms. Dr. Keith Wool, a distinguished eye surgeon, was so confident in his home security system, he kept $1 million of jewelry and cash in his bedroom vault. One January evening, he was relaxing at home. Suddenly, 3 armed men burst in on him. At gunpoint, they demanded the combination to his safe. They didn't need to ask where it was located.
They cracked open the safe. As I recall, got over $1 million out of that safe.
But when the safe was opened, it triggered a silent alarm that went to the police station. They sent a car to check it out. One of the robbers had placed a walkie-talkie radio on the table. Dr. Wold heard a voice telling the gang to get out. Cops were on their way. By the time the police arrived, the robbers and the safe contents were long gone. Dr. Wold couldn't tell the police much about his assailants. He was puzzled that they knew exactly where his safe was. In their rush to get out, the robbers had left the walkie-talkie behind, but there were no fingerprints on it. The only other clue was a chocolate bar wrapper in the garden. Police quickly realized this was the work of a well-organized gang who knew how to hide their tracks. What they didn't know yet was that the mastermind behind this crime was one of the most successful burglars America has ever seen.
He had committed burglaries up and down the East Coast of the United States, from mid-Atlantic states, possibly New England, all the way down to Florida.
The police dubbed him Superthief. He was thought to be responsible for thousands of break-ins worth millions of dollars. But unless police could find a clue at the crime scene, catching Superthief would be mission impossible. Burglars had just skipped away from Dr. Keith Wold's house with $1 million in cash and jewels. Fort Lauderdale police had no idea who organized the raid, but they were familiar with his work. A rash of sophisticated burglaries in the best neighborhoods, millions of dollars stolen. Police suspected that just one man was masterminding all the burglaries, and he seemed to know their every move. They called him Superthief. Superthief's real name was Jack McLean. McLean was fascinated with police work and was forever listening to their frequencies. But he never wanted to be a cop.
The way he thought he was going to make his mark was by being a terrific burglar, and he was a really good burglar.
Jack grew up in a trailer home in Reading, Massachusetts, in a poor but happy family. He was a bright boy, fascinated by electrical gadgets.
Don't think he had much formal education, but he was not a dumb guy. I think he thought that it was an easier way to make money than being some schlub who went to work 9 to 5 every day.
I think he probably got into crime because of the thrill of it, and it was his way to prove how smart he was, because he could do these things which were criminal offenses and not get caught.
He was responsible for 2,000 burglaries worth $13 million in cash and jewels.
You know, one of the best. There's an ability to make a good plan, to consider eventualities and contingencies, to set goals, to accomplish those goals, you know, mainly break into homes and steal and make money that way.
Superthief was his nickname, and he looked the part. He always wore a dramatic cape that concealed his tools, gadgets, and police scanners. He picked his targets carefully, typically choosing large properties next to golf courses and parks, so he could disappear into the landscape.
He would generally operate at night, which many residential burglars operate during the day. He would walk, if need be, a little bit of a distance from his car to access a home.
In between jobs, he studied burglar alarms and learned how to disable them.
He would only break into houses that had burglar alarms, because his assumption was that there'd be better loot in a house that had a burglar alarm.
I'm sure he enjoyed thinking about these people coming home saying, you know, my house is safe, it's been alarmed, and then find out that it's been burglarized. John was that much of an egotist that it only created a challenge for him.
He once broke into a house where he could not disarm the burglar alarm. It was a new model, so he tore the burglar alarm off the wall, left the house with the burglar alarm so that he could learn how to disarm that one.
McLean always took his time burglarizing a home, stopping for a bite to eat or a moment of humor.
He typically would do something funny, so he would often open up a phone book, circle the phone number of the local police, and write on the phone book, "Call this number, your house has been burgled."
He would even play bizarre practical jokes on his victims, such as taping dentures to doorknobs.
He had a funny sense of humor, but he was fundamentally interested in money.
And he wasn't shy about spending it.
He had a couple of airplanes.
I believe he owned a helicopter and a fixed wing, if I'm not mistaken, at least one boat.
He lived a nice life.
And it was a lifestyle he didn't want to put at risk. If he thought the stolen jewelry was too hot to handle, he wouldn't risk selling it. He'd fly his helicopter over the ocean and dump it. McLean seemed unstoppable until he started planning the wool heist. Normally, Superthief worked alone and only robbed houses when the owners were away. A year before the big raid, he'd entered Dr. Keith Wold's house while the eye surgeon was out.
In the course of looting the house, had discovered that the house contained a safe.
But Superthief had been unable to open it. He realized that it probably contained a big stash of jewelry and cash, and he wanted it. For the first time in his career, he decided to return with a gang. He'd never worked with others before. It was a decision he'd regret for the rest of his life. Superthief briefed his team, telling them exactly how to carry out the robbery. He gave them a walkie-talkie radio and told them they must be quick, efficient, and leave no clues. He would stay outside and keep watch. also listened to police transmissions. If cops were on the way, he'd call his gang on the walkie-talkie. His plan was now in his associates' hands. He didn't like violence, but he also didn't like relying on others. It was a tense time for him. Shortly after the gang had opened the safe, Superthief realized the law had been alerted. It was time to leave. He radioed the gang out, and they fled. When they met up afterwards, he realized they'd made a big mistake.
He said to the guys that he was with, "Do you have the money? Yeah. Do you have this? Yeah. Do you have the radio? No."
The radio was still on the table in Dr. Wold's house. It was too late to go back and get it. Superthief knew that if police examined the radio very closely, they'd find the only clue that could lead to his downfall. Two weeks after the robbery at Dr. Wold's house, Fort Lauderdale police were no nearer to discovering who the mastermind was. It seemed like a perfect crime. But then they decided to take a closer look at the abandoned radio. The serial number had been removed so it couldn't be traced. But inside, there were 4 crystals.
Jack had manufactured for him some crystals for walkie-talkies that worked on frequencies that were in between the normal frequencies that most walkie-talkies would have, so that he could communicate with his accomplices without anyone else being able to overhear the conversation.
The crystals had been stamped with the code number for Savoy Electronics in Fort Lauderdale. Sifting through invoices, Savoy Electronics came up with the customer's name, Bob Frost.
They found out that some other similar crystals had been ordered by the person who had ordered these.
10 days later, the man calling himself Bob Frost came into the store for his new crystals. The manager called the police, who then trailed him back to his home. Records revealed that this house was owned by John Arthur McLean. Inside, McLean was listening to his police radios as he did morning, noon, and night, when he realized that the police were in the process of raiding his home. Before he could escape, he was arrested. In his house, the police found $1 million worth of stolen jewelry, including items from the Wold residence. Jack McLean was found guilty of burglary and sentenced to 15 years in jail. Florida's Superthief had been caught. His life of crime was over. For the time being.
He thought that he was a very, very clever guy, and that had not this one bad experience happened, he'd be still, flying around his airplanes and driving his motorcycle and blah, blah, blah.
7 years later in Arizona, burglaries were on the rise. Over the next 3 years, there were 150 break-ins in Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, and Northeast Phoenix, with $3 million reported stolen.
We had been experiencing a very identifiable trend or pattern of residential burglaries to higher-end homes, mostly located along golf courses or green belts, happening at night, usually when the people were not at home.
Scottsdale police realized they were dealing with just one man.
He would usually break into the master bedroom area master suite area, and in such a way as to not trip the alarm. And he would take small items such as jewelry and things like that, and then off he would go.
At this stage, police had no idea they were looking for Superthief. After being released early from prison for good behavior, Jack McClain had moved to Tempe, Arizona.
I understand he was living a flamboyant lifestyle in Florida. In Arizona, he was living in a mobile home park. So basically he had a house trailer. It wasn't a flashy lifestyle. He didn't have fancy cars or boats or, anything to show he'd gotten a great deal of money from his activities.
McClain was keeping a low profile. Scottsdale police had no idea a notorious burglar was in their midst. But then the FBI contacted them. They knew Jack McClain had moved west, and they suspected he was back at work.
He was just a person that the FBI knew as a super burglar who had a reputation from a previous conviction in Florida, doing a lot of burglaries and high-level burglaries.
They were kind of warning us that this guy was in town. As we began to talk and compare notes, we realized this man's history would definitely make him somebody we want to look at for these burglaries.
Scottsdale police put McClain under surveillance.
We would at times have, a week where there were at least 10 to 15, maybe 20 detectives out just watching neighborhoods, hoping to catch this guy.
Over a almost 2-year period, we did so many surveillances, just hoping, the type of neighborhoods he was hitting, hoping to catch him, and those were unsuccessful.
McClain seemed to have a sixth sense about being watched. In fact, he used police radios and a CCTV system at his trailer home to keep tabs on his adversaries.
This mobile home, a bank of video monitors, I believe it was 5 or 6 across. And each one of those monitors was hooked up to a camera watching one side or the other of his mobile home park, which we assumed was counter surveillance to see if the police were watching him.
Jack McClain was quietly stealing another fortune. It looked like Superthief would never be caught again. But then the FBI came up with just the evidence they needed to nail him. In Scottsdale, Arizona, Jack McClain had stolen $3 million in 3 years with no end in sight. Police seemed powerless to stop him. But then the FBI had a breakthrough.
FBI received some information from a confidential informant that a jeweler in a small town in Maine was receiving shipments of jewelry regularly from Scottsdale, Arizona.
Every Tuesday morning, this guy there, his name was Keith Richardson, would get a package of jewelry from FedEx.
The FBI got the informant to buy some of the jewelry.
And then we were able to identify them positively as having come from burglaries in Scottsdale, Arizona.
We began to do some research on the Federal Express shipments, etc., in conjunction with the FBI, and eventually determined that it was Mr. McClain who was mailing the jewelry.
Police could now prove McClain was selling stolen jewels, but they didn't have any evidence that he was responsible for the break-ins. Then police had a stroke of luck. Someone spotted a burglar breaking into a neighbor's house.
Police responded to a burglary in progress call and just happened to catch him there hiding in a neighbor's backyard after he had run from the scene.
The burglar was none other than Jack McClain. Superthief had been caught red-handed.
He knew he was under surveillance at the time, and he still did not stop from committing the burglary. And of course, as law enforcement knows, the more times you commit crimes, the closer law enforcement gets to identifying and arresting the person. So he contributed to his own arrest.
When his case came to court, Jack McClain decided to defend himself.
He thought he was very smart. He didn't need an attorney. He thought he was smarter than everybody else.
When you think you can defend yourself in court, it doesn't make sense. He wanted the attention, and this was his last hurrah, and he knew that before he was going to prison.
With overwhelming evidence against him, McClain lost the case and was sentenced to 16 years.
And when you make $3 million in 3 years, not a bad return. Unfortunately, 16 years of prison is not worth $3 million to me.
In jail, McClain decided to spend his time usefully.
He wrote a book about how to avoid having your house get broken into. You know, this was ostensibly part of his repayment to society. But it was called Secrets of a Superthief, and it was basically, you know, how to make your house more burglar-proof.
But not everyone thinks Jack McClain is reformed.
Now, like I say, when he gets out, what he'll do, only he knows. But I think probably he'll go back to what he knows best.